So hello, everybody. Welcome to our order of execution session. Become an order of execution hero. I had the joy to compete with True to the Core yesterday and Barack Obama today. Now it's lunch, so enjoy your lunch. While we're talking about one of the most promising topics in Salesforce at all, it is something that can go down every rabbit hole. But before we start, we have to show you this. This is the forward-looking statement. Salesforce is a publicly traded company. You shouldn't make any purchasing decisions based on the technology you see today and not what we're saying. That's Mark.
Yeah, fantastic. Hi everyone. I'm Mark. I'm a trailblazer since 2010. I work for a company in Germany called Artex Partners. And I started investigating into the order of execution in 2015. And I'm very pleased to be here together with my friend Daniel, who has fantastic and amazing shoes. Have a look.
Yeah, if you're interested, I'll tell you the story later. My name is Daniel Stange. I'm working as a technical architect with an implementation partner in Germany, DRD Interaktiven. I'm on Twitter @Stangomat. I want to get my 1,000 followers full this day, so please follow me on Twitter if you don't do already. And when I took up the topic of the order of execution, there was a slide that paved the way, and Mark is the author of that slide that brought us together. So, for starters, who of you is actually deeper into the order of execution? Is there someone who has deep knowledge? What do you think? Quick show of hands. Deep knowledge, average. Okay, starters. Okay, most of you have average knowledge, okay. So have you run into issues that are caused by the order of execution before? Okay, I could have guessed. That's a rhetorical question. Can you give us an idea what the kind of issues are that you experience? Just shout whatever you find.
The most common is recursive issues.
Mm-hmm, exactly. We'll go into that later, but the use case where we actually where our interest came from is exactly this. We're doing these sessions because we had some kind of issues and we found strange things. Mark, you had one.
Yeah, so the first reason we're doing this session is you might find yourself getting unexpected outcomes of what you actually implemented. And one of my examples is I was asked as an architect to do a review of an org where we had the fact that you could save an account and it could be duplicated. So you would have 2 account records, or it would be deleted. So that happened, right? And we could prove that it's strange. So that was a point where we had to go deeper. We're going to talk about this in a moment. The second reason is we're doing this session, you might hit some limits, some governor limits on the platform. Daniel, do you want to tell us more about limits?
Yeah, my example is not that exciting, actually. But you probably know the scenario. A customer or any admin comes up to you and says, it has been working all the time, and suddenly it changed. Your code is bad. It throws a CPU time exception. Can you fix it? What did you do? And you did nothing for a year or so. That happened to me just last week, and it took me less than a minute to find out what it was, actually. But people don't actually know and expect this. So you probably can relate to this. This is something I found. My friend Daniel Peter posted on Twitter lately, and we couldn't stop laughing about it. Every now and then, things go in loops, and there's almost nothing you can do about it. There's even no emergency stuff for that. So let's get back to the definition. Before we start and go deeper into why it goes into loops, we have to look into the order of execution and what it is.
Yeah.
So can we rephrase it and don't say it's an old man turning on the escalator?
Yeah. So the order of execution is something that has been defined on the Salesforce platform, and it describes a path a record takes through all automations. Automations is the keyword. And events that happen from a save, when you hit the save button or you use the API, to the database commit. So when it's finally done, it's a path that is described. Not more, Just this is the order of execution. It's something in order. So, and when you do when you look on the documentation, who did it? Who saw this page? The order of execution? I would say it's 50%, half of you, right? It's a long list of 20 steps, and you shouldn't be able to read this right now, but it comes with a 20-step documentation, and there's another document which is called additional considerations, which describes the nitty-gritty details, which made me started to look into this in more detail because I'm a German engineer, right? So I started researching on this in 2015, and it ended up in weekends and weeks and nights to find out the details, and we're going to share a few findings here today. So what comes to your mind when you hear the order of execution? Shout out. Trigger. Workflows. Validation rules. Fantastic. Errors. Yeah. There's many things that happen, right? So a lot of things can actually happen, and this all needs to get into some order, and you as an admin or developer, you need to control what's going on. And Daniel, do you want to help us bring this into some order?
That's probably less intuitive than the original document, right? So yes, let's probably map it out in a way that we can see it as a path. That really
yeah, sorry. You can take screenshots, but we're going to share all the slides later on the Chatter post of this presentation. So feel free to take pictures, but we share all of this.
Yeah. So this is still the same 20 points, and it's still hard to comprehend. So probably let's frame the things that are really important here. We talked about errors that come from automations, and this is actually where the automations that are relevant for the demos that we show later. It's the trigger, it's the workflow action, and it's the process builder. And why are these important? Because they can cause recursions, or we rather call it loops, because technically recursion is something different than what we see here. Or re-entry, that's however you phrase it. We call it loops for simplicity here. And whenever a workflow rule or a process builder does something, it fires triggers again, and it goes into that loop. And this is actually where these perpetual moving thing in your org is coming from. So Mark, I still think we need something to make this more visual. Let's do a little demo.
Yeah, so that was a nice order, but a lot of information. So let's do a scenario. We're going to have Cody. Cody is blue, and he stands for a trigger, a simple trigger that runs. Then we have Sazi. Sazi is a workflow field update. This is red. And we're going to have in black Astro, who is a process builder field update. And so far, it's easy. The question is, when we build a house, so when we paint a house, how many layers of color is it we're going to have? Right? We have a trigger, a workflow, and a process builder. How many layers of color do we have? And what is the final color of this house? Any ideas? Black. Process builder is last. Black. Black. Anyone else? Blue. There's a blue one. Do we have a red? How many layers do we have? 3? Okay. Let's see that in action.
Let's do it.
Let's see that in action. So I prepared here something we call an asset. So we're going to create an asset that has a trigger, workflow, and a process builder up and running. And for some reason, there's a lookup to an account. So let's save this, right? This is all I'm doing. And the answer is blue. So the gentleman in this corner, he was right. So it is blue, and the number of paintings is 5. Isn't that surprising? That's the reason why you're here, so thanks you came. And the key question is, why is it like that? Right? So, and here's the point, why this goes in loops. It starts with a trigger, which is blue. Then the workflow field update starts. And then the trigger runs again, followed by the process builder field update, and fired the trigger again. So the trigger always wins. And that's by design. The trigger always wins. Whatever you have in a trigger, it wins. So Daniel, can we do this a bit more advanced?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Process Builder, and Process Builder should win in the end. So I'm using the recursion flag in Process Builder to re-evaluate and rerun the rules over and over again, so that eventually my Process Builder will power through and paint the house black. And just for backwards compatibility, I also do the re-evaluation flag on the workflow rule as well, so that the workflow rule that paints the house red will be re-evaluated. So that's an easy game. We paint the house, and this is where you set it. It's quite obvious in the workflow action, where you can set re-evaluate workflow rules after that. And there's another flag. The flag in Process Builder is more hidden away, so it's folded away by default, and you have to unfold it and set it to yes, and that is foreshadowing the result, because the behavior is completely different. And the behavior is really dangerous. That's why they keep it hidden away from standard configuration. It is more dangerous because when you re-evaluate workflow rules after a field update, it won't re-evaluate the same rule again, but only the other ones that are affected by that. Whereas when you set the flag in Process Builder, it will rerun the whole process all over again until it reaches the end of the execution. We'll see later what that means. But that's the questions that we do have now, still the same. Do you think the house will be anything else but blue? Yes or no? No? Good guess. And what do you think? How many layers of paints will be on the house? It's not 5. And I solved the riddle immediately. There will be 15 layers of paints on the house, but the house is still blue, even though I asked Process Builder to really nail it and paint the house black. So that got me thinking, why is it that way, and what did actually happen? And I have a guy who's trained in doing demos, so over to Mark to do this again, to solve the riddle for me.
Okay, let's create a new one. Dreamforce 19 loops.
So let me see this.
And I turn on the flag for the re-evaluation, and let's do this again. And what we see here, it's blue and 15. And when you go down, we have the log file. And so it's the workflow field update as before, and then we have trigger, process. And by the way, if anyone wonders why the very first one is not blue, that is because the workflow field update had to update this text field, and it can't handle HTML things. So it's another learning we had when we played around with it. But so it's 15. It is 15, and
it's exactly what was written in the help text. It runs up to 6 times. That's why Process Builder eventually fades out.
So it's this loop runs 6 times, and then it's over, right? You can't do this unlimited. 6 times it is. And so we have 8 triggers in total, 1 workflow, and 6 Process Builder field updates. And we didn't talk about the difference between Process Builder. Someone might ask themselves, what about flows? Flows and Process Builder is exactly the same under the hood, so it's the same. When we say Process Builder field updates, it could stand for flow as well. So what is the big difference from a workflow? Let's look into this. And a workflow field update, right, that is step 11 or 10, and then we go through a small loop. And this small loop it starts with the system validations, no custom validations, system validations only. So for example, if this is an email that is in an email field, that could be a system validation. Then the before trigger starts, it's saved, and the after trigger. That's it, not more. And I said it, there's no custom validation and no duplicate rules are fired again. This is it. And when you compare this to the workflow, to the process builder. The process builder came in later, right? Historically, workflow builder was first. So it's a different approach. They start actually the sales cycle again. So that runs through the custom validation and the duplicate rules as well. And it loops. What it doesn't do, there's no assignment rules anymore and no auto-response rules. So this is set the very first time. So if you need to play around with these assignment rules at a later point in time, you have to do it manually. You need to create a process or write some code doing it. Good. So far, so good. Daniel, could it get any worse and more complicated?
Oh yeah, there are still some inconvenient truths in our box. You have probably heard of Trigger.old that keeps the state of the record before the trigger was fired. You're probably using it a lot. So let's have a look what's going on under the hood while we're going through that cycle. What we did in the demo was creating a field that was used as a counter, and we increased the value by 1. So it's not actually necessary that you can read all of this. What we're pointing here is the blue bubbles are where, the new value for that field in the save cycle. So we increase it by 1 from after in the trigger, then by the workflow rule to 2, and so on and so on. So you can see the actual value of the field going up by 1. And we expect to trace this in Trigger.old as well, so that we can compare, was the field value 14 before we entered the last trigger, then we increase it by 1. So we expect for it to be reflected in Trigger.old. Did you expect Trigger.old to be the same always over the execution? You probably did, or probably didn't. But did you know that workflow rules have a different behavior, and process builder does introduce a different behavior here? So what we actually see in Trigger.old is, can you see what the value for Trigger.old is when we re-enter the trigger? It's not 2, it's 1. And when we reach the trigger for the second time, the value is 3, not 4, as the actual value that fired the trigger. Definition for Trigger.old is it keeps the value for the moment before the trigger that actually fired the trigger, but it's not the actual value that the workflow rule that introduced on the object before, that fired the trigger. It's the state the record was before the last trigger was fired, more or less. So this is a quirk. It's documented somehow, but Mark, that looks like a bug for me. Should we file that?
We should probably, or we shouldn't, because that is my most example of the additional considerations, right? That is hidden into
right.
one of these additional considerations with an example. But I read this documentation for years, and until I did this as a proof of concept, I didn't really understand what they wanted to tell me. That might be because I'm German and not a native speaker, but here we have it, right? And we have, as I said, we could file a bug. We actually have been asked by Salesforce to do it, that they could review it, and it might be something that could be changed somewhere in the future, right? Forward-looking statement. Because even the product management team was not fully aware of this behavior under the hood. So, but for you guys here in the room, if you use Trigger.old, know what you're doing. It might be not what you expect it to be. So when is Trigger.old actually updated? Every time it enters a before trigger, the Trigger.old is updated. And we had discussions in the past with developers, and we hear people saying Trigger.old is never updated. It's never updated. That's wrong. If someone says it doesn't get updated, it's wrong. It gets updated, but every time it hits the before trigger. And so if you go in loops, it gets updated again. That's one of the learnings we found out here. So how does it actually scale? How does it scale? And that's the key question, right? We're here to learn about the order of execution, and at the same time we said we want to build scalable apps. And there are many things that could happen. So far, that was easy, right? It was one record. But we could we could go crazy, right? We have the before triggers. We could update our own record. And then the after trigger starts. In the after trigger, you could update or create other records. And every time you do this, you enter a save cycle again. So that gets complicated, right, and multiplied. The same for workflow actions. You could create a task. You might have a trigger on a task running, which does something else and updates an account and processes and flows. Could even invoke Apex code. Apex could invoke a flow. So it could get really, really off. And even the roll-up summaries could fire workflow field updates, and they go through a save cycle as well. So that looks quite complicated, doesn't it? And what happens, the key question is, if it's overdone, we're going to talk about limits in a moment, but if something goes wrong at any point here, what happens? Who knows it? It's a rollback, exactly. So we're going to go return to sender. Nothing happens on your org, not even auto number fields are updated, just nothing. Most people know, but it's important, right? And you might find this could work for years, and then something gets added on there's another workflow field update running on an object, for example, on an account, and you just created an asset, and it might break. And that's one of the reasons. Daniel, can you tell us a bit more about the limits and best practices and your learnings in the past?
So let's consider what might happen when you leave the happy path. We talked about creating one record. That's what you said, and it's the happy path that everything went well. So, but the things that you actually do on one record don't necessarily reflect what happens when you put 200 records in there. And the inconvenient truth is actually that you share the same set of limits for the whole transactions regardless of the number of records that go in, regardless of the number of managed packages that you have in the org. So it's still 10,000 milliseconds, 100 SOCL calls, 50,000 lines returned from the SOCL call, and so on, regardless of the executed unit in this transaction. So you want to have the transaction quite flat. And especially the CPU time limit is something that's really tricky because it's one of the toughest limits that you could hit because when you hit the CPU time limit, nothing else will happen. You can't even catch the exception that comes out of it because you don't have time left to execute Apex around it and catch the exception. So you're done. On the other hand, Mark highlighted it all in this slide. It's a soft limit somehow because it depends on the condition of the org and the cluster you're on, what the actual CPU time limit is. You definitely get 10,000 milliseconds, but in some circumstances, you get more. If there's a lot of load on the org, you get more. If you're on a sandbox, you could possibly get more. So you be on the lookout that your transaction always and in all conditions stays within a 10,000 millisecond limit because the fact that it works on your sandbox doesn't necessarily mean that it works in production on another day. So keep an eye on the limit consumption of your transactions at all times, and watch out for the asterisk, 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 close to limit line in your debug logs, because you can find something important there. Speaking of debug logs, here's your new friend. If you didn't know that, you know now. The developer console has a nice feature that is the analysis perspective, which you can switch on by increasing the debug log granularity to finer on profiling and adding finer or finest for Apex and finer or finest for workflows. And if you start the analysis perspective, you'll get a visualization like this. And based on that visualization, you can jump into the executed unit at that certain point in time. And here's the solution for the riddle that I had with the customer just a week before Dreamforce. This is exactly the scenario. It's actually a debug log from that org. They built a process builder on something that I had built in a trigger. So we went into that purple, orange, ping pong, and at the 13th or 15th ping pong, CPU time ran out, and boom, it was my Apex trigger that exploded. And I thought the problem is in a code that was written a year ago or so. And turning to you, Mark,
Yeah.
you have probably guessed what the answer is, but what was the problem in your case?
Yeah, so what could have been my problem, right? Multiple triggers on the same object. If you have more than one trigger, we have no idea which one runs first, right? It could be trigger A, could be trigger B. It even gets more complicated when you have app exchange packages installed, right? Then you have workflows, processes, triggers in your org. You even don't know, or you don't know the details. So in my example, we had duplicate or deleted. It was a combination of each and everything. We had two duplicate tools installed, and the triggers ran independently from each other, and then there were another code. So we had 6, 7 triggers in it. So in this case, it was A in this example, but it could also be the multiple workflow. So don't have multiple workflows on it, or too many. Processes, whenever you start a new process for the same object, Salesforce asks you if you want to update the existing one for a reason. For a reason. And of course, coding in production is never a good idea. So all of these could cause problem. So we're done with the order of execution, or what we want to talk about. There's the very last step in the order of execution is called the after commit logic. So things that happened after you're done, after the account got updated.
That's quite a lot.
And there's a lot, and this is there's for sure more, but a few things we wanted to highlight to each and every one of you. So emails are sent later. So emails. Of course, asynchronous epics. It is asynchronous that it runs later. Outbound messages for the people who still do it on workflow. They're sent later. And indexes, such as the search index, is calculated later. And also file previews in Chatter are done later. And one thing that is important to know, platform events. If you fire a platform event during the order of execution, it's gone. And if you run into a problem later, there's a return to sender, the platform event is gone. So take that in mind when you design your system. The events are gone. Whatever you do with your event, it's gone. You can't take it back. That's the logic or the magic of an event, right? It's immediately done. So our lessons learned, we want to share with you. Check the documentation on the order of execution, the official documentation. Follow us, of course, on Twitter to learn more. And it gets updated, and we can promise you, because we know there are going to be updates within the next year on what's happening. And the rule of thumb is have one trigger, so put in your logic as good as you can, right? Even you have multiple developers, try to have one trigger only, because it gives you control and you know what's going to happen later. And also try to have one process only. Rule of thumb, right? You might find a reason to change it, but if you start with that approach, that's a good starting point. Make the debug log your best friend. You should know how to debug in case something happens. If you don't know how to do it, know someone who does. And watch out for the close to limit when it comes to time. And also consider, you could test this in your sandbox, and you put it in production, and there might be different data. There might be more data over time, especially when you build a new org. The org is empty, you put in the first data, and then within 2 years, there's more and more data. So come up with some creative test approach, put in a lot of data, see what happens. Especially when you know you go in loops or you have this cascading thing. And which brings to the next point. Try to avoid a setup where you start these loopings. And if you do, know what you're doing. Try to build a trigger that doesn't fire it again, right? Try to catch it somehow. It consumes time and energy. And handle the trigger.old with care, right? We learned it might be different than you thought. And my very last point is test, test, test. You can't test this enough, especially when you're in regulated environments where it's really important that your org runs. And, yeah, that's our lessons learned. Daniel.
So let's go to further learning. Unfortunately, there is not the one order of execution module or project on Trailhead. So you have to look for nuggets in other modules. And one of the places where I found really valuable information is actually where Salesforce and the Trailer team tries to onboard programmers from a different platform. So if you are interested in the execution context, look into the Apex and .NET Basics module, because there's information for people that actually don't know Salesforce at all. And that's a valuable asset. The other thing is definitely the Developer Console Basics batch, because that really teaches you how to use the Developer Console. You should also look into the order of execution documentation, even though it is a long page. And another quite scary page, but you should look into that, is the record locking cheat sheet. Because whenever you touch something in a transaction, you are locking the records for further edits from other users so that the state is more or less not turning into quicksand while you're editing records. So you're locking a lot of records in your transaction, and you can learn a lot about it in the cheat sheet. And this man sitting in the front of you did a course with me, and he asked me about a year ago if I know the order of execution. I said, yes. So we did a course, and if you don't want to pay for it immediately or don't have a subscription just now, you can try it with Don's magical new Lightning Web Components website. Go there, give your personal data as a lead to Don, and Don provides you with a free 30 days trial. That's the deal we're doing. It's really great to watch my course, but also all the other courses. And I had a lot of fun recording that stuff with Don and digging even deeper and deeper into the order of execution. And with that, you know, we're going in circles all of the time. The session is now over. The next thing will be Q&A, as in all the other sessions we had before. And we have about 7 minutes, so there should be 2 or 3 questions. If there are more questions, let's move outside and have a talk then. If you have a question for the sake of the recording, please use the mic. Or if you want to have your own voice recorded, I'll repeat the question after that. But with that, thank you for the moment.